Great crowd here this evening to kick off the series on a dividing Ireland in a dividing Europe. And I want to go over some old ground maybe we discussed last year when we were looking at the first half of the decade before moving on to something that people may not have heard a lot about, but which impacted on Ireland for about a year and included local participation even from Cookstown, the Cookstown area. So I want to take you back just very quickly, of course. We're talking about the Decade of Centenaries. And I suppose it begins about 2012. We've been remembering the Home Rule crisis, the rise of the two rival volunteer armies. We looked at the Great War, and we've got as far as, of course, we've looked at the Rising, we've looked at the Battle of the Somme, and we're moving into the second half now of the decade. Maybe I have to use the manual.
I think we'll be up and going and we'll roll.
So I want to just recap on the impact of the 1916 Rising on Ireland, the shift in Irish public opinion, and the implications of that. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Before looking at forward. That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. That's great. So basically, Trinity College Dublin, the beginnings, I suppose, of the story of the Irish Convention, but also an appropriate slide, because Trinity College Dublin, the University of Dublin, founded in the 1590s by Elizabeth I, as part of the, I suppose, preliminary to the plantations. And Trinity was also the headquarters of the British military during that one-week rebellion, Éamon, the Easter Rising of April 1916. And it was to Trinity College that Herbert Henry Asquith, the Prime Minister of the coalition government, the Liberal Premier who had introduced Home Rule, placed the Home Rule Bill on the statute book in 1914. It was there he sojourned for a couple of days after the first executions. In fact, his presence in Ireland and pressure on Asquith was to change the policy of executions. You remember that 90 insurgents and insurgent leaders were sentenced to death, but only 15 executions were carried out. People like Éamon de Valera, for example, had their sentences commuted to penal servitude for life. And of course, that would change the course of Irish history, much as the Rising had in the spring of 1916. So the Rising itself, of course, was a slow-ticking time bomb, really from the Edwardian years, the early years of the 20th century. On the global stage, you had the beginning of the great power alliances. On the one hand, you had the emerging kind of alliance of the Central Powers. The German Empire led by the Kaiser Wilhelm, Austria-Hungary with its 12 or 13 nationalities struggling to be free, and for a while Italy. They were kind of the Central Powers. As against that, you have the emergence of the Triple Entente by 1907. Britain, France, Russia. You had that naval rivalry heating up from the 1890s between Britain, the Royal Navy, and of course the Kaiser and his fleet of warships and indeed U-boats. All attempts to halt that rivalry, that arms race, as late as 1910 by the British Foreign Ministry failed. And so we were drifting towards a war in Europe by that stage, which was exacerbated by nationalist issues in the Balkans and indeed gunboat diplomacy, the Moroccan crises of that period, and so on. So it was really in the Edwardian years in Ireland, the quieter years, when the Triple Entente was being conceived, that a small group of revolutionaries were formed first in Belfast, then in Dublin. These were young men attempting to revive the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that Fenian movement formed after the Great Famine in America, in Ireland, the rather catastrophic failure of the Rising of 1867, but nonetheless the IRB soldiered on with Tone's motto, I suppose, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. Now that small group of men Men like Bulmer Hobson, the former Belfast Quaker, Sean McDermott arrived via Glasgow in Belfast in 1905. Ernest Blythe, for example, Dennis McCullough and others. Those young Turks would eventually link up with old Tom Clark, who was domiciled in this town in the 1850s, 1860s, who had served imprisonment for Fenian offences, had touched base with Fenian America and had set up base as a shopkeeper in Dublin in 1907. And old Tom Clark, he was 58, wouldn't like to be anything like that myself. And old Tom Clark wanted to strike a blow for Irish freedom before he died. And he believed in Tom's mantra, England's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity. And with the Young Turks, trained in the north in those years, 1900 to 1910, they reformulated the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Of course, it wasn't likely to succeed. The vast mass of Irish nationalists, north and south, in that undivided Ireland, ruled from Dublin Castle, the great mass of nationalists wanted home rule within the empire. And as someone said, they hankered after the oratorical gold that fell from the lips of John Redmond. John Redmond, a moderate, conservative, upper-class nationalist, a British imperialist, who wanted to reconcile Britain and Ireland and North and South. That was his project during those years, down to his death, as the Irish Convention concluded in 1916. And it was really the Ulster crisis, the emergence of Carson's army, that, as one historian put it, reignited the Fenian flame in those years, 1910 to 1916. The example of Ulster transformed Ireland. The Irish volunteers emerged at the end of 1913 to match the firepower and the manoeuvres of the Ulster volunteers in the north, from Down to Donegal, that 90,000 strong citizen army, welcomed by the IRB. It was Owen MacNeill, a northern nationalist, co-founder of the Gaelic League, who wrote in 1913, "The North began," quoting the poet Thomas Davis, that somehow the North stood for a reignition of the forces of Irish nationalism, the United Irishmen, the Presbyterian radicals of the 18th century. And so by 1914, Ireland had been on the brink of civil war. And as John Redmond supported the war, the Irish volunteers split. Their great mass went on at Redmond's behest to the battlefields of Europe in the 16th Irish Division. But a minority of about 12,000 remained. And they would become the strike force, manipulated by the IRB, still commanded by Owen MacNeill, to become really the core of the insurgent forces in the 1916 rising. And what was planned as an all-Ireland revolt was narrowed to Dublin, which made it, of course, less likely to be a military success and more likely to be a blood sacrifice, something that Pearse and his fellow poet Thomas MacDonagh had envisioned in their plays and poetry before 1916. Narrowed to Dublin. One of the rebel leaders put it very well, Sean McDermott, who was regularly in Tyrone in the years before 1916, organising and reorganising the IRB. And McDermott, as he was better known, wrote around this time to a friend, "We'll hold Dublin for a week and save Ireland." Now we know what he meant by that. That somehow by the execution of the leaders, by their martyrdom, they would change the course of Irish history. And of course that's what happened. 500 people died, vast majority civilians. And even today I hear in the news that Éamon de Valera's grandson has opened an exhibition of letters in County Antrim, letters between de Valera after the rising and the British officer who took his surrender. And this correspondence continued down to the 1960s between these two men from that period. But of course, the rising was a military failure, but it was a propaganda success. James Connolly, the co-leader of the rising, a socialist Republican based in Belfast at that time, had famously said that the British would never shell capitalist buildings in Dublin. Dublin, the second city of the British Empire at this time. But of course they did. General Sir John Maxwell was sent in, and he said you can't crush an insurrection in time of war with velvet gloves. And he believed he was using the mailed fist both in crushing the rising and in organising the court-martials and the executions. In fact, he was given carte blanche at this time. He tends to be remembered, though, as the man who lost an empire. If you see Ireland as the first kind of part of the British Empire, most of it anyway, to sever its ties after the Irish Revolution and so on. So Trinity College is where Maxwell and General Lowe were based. Pearse eventually surrendered. O'Connell Street was in ruins. The executions occurred. And it was Lady Fingal, an Anglo-Irish aristocratic lady, who had been entertaining the court-martial officers at her castle in County Meath. It was Lady Fingal who wrote about the executions in secret, spun out day after day, at a time of military censorship, to a stunned population whose city had been in the throes of revolution. It was Lady Fingal who wrote. It was like watching blood, she wrote, oozing from under a closed door, with the same effect on public opinion, pushing what had been moderate Home Rule nationalism more and more towards a clamant demand for an all-Ireland republic, the cause of Pearse and Connolly, and indeed, centuries earlier, Wolfe Tone himself. So the Rising sets the scene for everything that follows. You still have the Home Rule Party, led by the big three, John Redmond, his deputy John Dillon, and the Northern leader, Joe Devlin, whose finger was very much on the Northern nationalist pulse, who had built up the Home Rule Party really on the basis of the ancient order of Hibernians, with its lodges across Ulster in these years. Devlin, of course, who had described Ulster resistance as, quote, grotesquely exaggerated in the years before 1914. But the British now regarded Ireland as having been on the brink of civil war in 1914. The Germans, of course, had sent an armed ship, courtesy of Sir Roger Casement, to assist the Rising. And so John Redmond was to describe the Rising as a wicked German plot. But as the executions continued, Redmond and his deputies began to try to intervene to persuade the British government that these were, quote, washing away our life's work in a river of blood. Asquith came on the 5th of May 1916, stayed in Dublin, visited Belfast, took soundings and began to stop the executions. Connolly was the last, shot in a chair because he was mortally wounded, was the last of the insurgent leaders to be executed. Now, when all of this began to come out over that summer and afterwards, the change in public opinion was very, very rapid indeed. And of course, almost immediately, John Redmond realised that public opinion was, if you like, drifting away from the old cause of the old party. He believed that somehow, if the Irish leaders couldn't rescue Home Rule from the surrounding chaos, the Home Rule movement was dead. And so this leads to frenzied negotiations in the summer of 1916, involving Lloyd George, the rising star of the Liberal cabinet, the Welsh-speaking Celt with his little Welsh-speaking cabinet around him. I throw this in because a Welsh MP spoke in Irish yesterday in the House of Commons, and it deserves to be mentioned. Lloyd George, of course, was a native Welsh speaker, and to ensure, as he rose up the ranks of the coalition during and after the war, he surrounded himself by Welsh-speaking advisors so that the English Tories couldn't understand what was going on. I'm not sure what Jeremy Corbyn's doing. Anyway, at the end of the day, Lloyd George undertook the Irish negotiations in the summer of 1916. There had been so much debate and controversy about the acreage for partition. Nationalism had initially rejected partition out of hand as the mutilation of the nation. Then they discussed county option, which Carson had rejected because it was temporary. But Carson had hinted back in 1914, against all his instincts as an all-Ireland unionist, as a man of the South, who was trying to get use Ulster as a weapon to block Home Rule completely. Now Carson was having to get the best deal for his Northern Unionist clients, not the all-Ireland in the folds of the Union Jack that he dreamt of, but the best deal. And he was talking more and more about the 6 plantation counties. Not historically correct, but we know what he meant. The present acreage of Northern Ireland is what he was talking about, as a kind of a homeland. And in this, of course, he was reflecting the considered views of Captain James Craig, his co-leader and a man whose finger was as much on the Orange pulse as Joe Devlin's was on the Hibernian pulse in the north. So these negotiations in May, June 1916 were fairly critical. Carson was to rally his supporters in the Ulster Hall on the 12th of June 1916, and they endorsed something that had seemed treasonous a few years earlier: the abandonment of those 80,000 loyalists in Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal. Breaching the covenant in the eyes of some delegates from the lost counties as they became known, tearing up a sacred document signed by 500,000 Ulster men and women in 1912. But Carson had reason for this. He was an imperialist. This was the crisis of the empire. Irish-American opinion was running very strongly anti-British at this time. The American ambassador in Washington, Cecil Spring Rice, had reported that anti-British feeling in the States was like fizz in a soda bottle. And so, dealing with this, if the British government were to achieve its national interest and bring America into the war, to tilt the balance against the Hun, papers full of this kind of propaganda, they had to be seen to be doing something about Ireland. And that's what Lloyd George was about, with this problem that had seemed so insoluble even a few months before. But Carson was armed with something else. He was armed with a written pledge from Lloyd George that exclusion, as it was known, the exclusion of the six counties, would be, quote, permanent and enduring. When it was referred back to Parliament at the end of the war, there would be an imperial conference, but he was given to believe that the most likely Tory-dominated government would honour its pledges to Ulster, going back to 1912, and even further back to Lord Randolph Churchill, and Ulster will fight. John Redmond must have realised that the exclusion of six counties was not likely to be reversed anytime soon. But they talked about partition, Redmond, Dillon, Devlin, as though it was a temporary thing. You never used the word partition. You talked about the exclusion of six counties. And Redmond and Devlin urged that there were certain advantages for the nationalists. First of all, there would be no parliament in Belfast, what had become known in nationalist quarters as Carson's Orange Parliament. There would be no Orange Parliament in Belfast. In fact, the North would be governed as Ireland had been until 1916, directly from Westminster, under direct rule. Secondly, Carson could feel that with limited home rule in the south, but British rule in the north, the prospects for the Irish Protestant minority, north and south, were perhaps less troublesome, less troubling than they had seen a few years earlier when he had led Carson's army. On the other hand, John Redmond pointed out that there would still be 100 Irish MPs at Westminster, the vast majority of them nationalists, and they would, if you like, have a duty of care for the protection of the 33% Catholic minority in the excluded area. However, in the rundown to the Nationalist Conference at the end of June, this played very badly west of the Bann. Huge meetings were held in Omagh and Enniskillen and Derry, where even the Bishop of Derry described the scheme as rot. And indeed, in Omagh in particular, a sort of a counter-leadership emerged to Redmond, known as the League of the Seven Attorneys. George Murnaghan, a local solicitor, F.J. O'Connor, a local solicitor, led the charge, and they formed, if you like, an anti-exclusion movement to oppose Redmond's idea. Of course, these tensions were unleashed at the Nationalist Conference in Belfast on the 23rd of June 1916. Held in a bleak hall at the back of the city centre, the old St Mary's Hall, and indeed on a day which was become known in nationalist history in the North as a Black Friday. And of course there was a huge dialectic debate at the conference, for example, just to give you a flavour of it. For example, you had a number of orators in particular. The hall was brimming with delegates, 750 from the most far-flung parts of the six counties: Garrison, Cullyhanna, Derry, who had come by train in the old days of the Great Northern Railway. And Redmond, Dillon and Devlin addressed the conference in particular, and Redmond warned that, well, first of all he said partition was only temporary, But he said if this scheme was rejected in Belfast, the constitutional movement would expire, and worse still, he would walk away from the leadership. So the Northern Nationalists would be responsible for the destruction of the great Home Rule Party of Parnell and the rest. Of course, he was attacked by this battery of anti-partition delegates from west of the Bann, led by a man called Frank O'Connor from Omagh, brilliant orator, local solicitor, who rejected these dastardly proposals, which would, he said, establish eventually an Orange ascendancy in the 6 counties. It's a very, very bitter debate. It went on for 5 hours, and in the end, Redmond's proposal to accept the scheme, the Lloyd George scheme, was passed by a majority of 475 to 265. But it was very clear that these proposals were unpopular with nationalists west of the Bann. And after this, the old Home Rule Party begins to break up as Hibernian lodges reconstitute themselves as Sinn Fein clubs, and within a year, the people who had opposed Redmond in St Mary's Hall, in Omagh, Enniskillen, South Armagh, Uri, had become the northern leadership of Sinn Fein, which was now, if you like, spreading across Ireland. Something like 250,000 members of Sinn Fein by the end of 1917. Now, what happened to this scheme, which would have produced a very soft border? Ireland would still have had a Lord Lieutenant in Dublin, would still have had an All-Ireland Royal Irish Constabulary police force, and the South would have had a Home Rule Parliament with limited powers. If you crossed from South Tyrone into Monaghan, for example, one imagined that there might be a slightly different rate, or the education system might have been slightly different, but it would be like going north of the border in Britain into Scotland. It would be a very, very soft border. The war continued, British bases would remain in Ireland, and the Union Jack would fly against the green flag, which it always had done on Redmond's platforms. Well, what destroyed the scheme, which you might say might have divided Ireland peacefully in 1916, after the conflict of the Rising, was really a forgotten element in the Irish equation, the Southern Irish Unionists. Carson's own people, who had sent him to represent them at Trinity College in 1892, who regarded him as a man who had their best interests at heart, who had encouraged him to lead Ulster Unionism if it meant saving all Ireland. Suddenly they realised they were going to be subjected, that 10%, that Church of Ireland minority, south of of Ulster, they were going to be subjected to a Home Rule Parliament in Dublin. They had powerful friends in the House of Lords, people like Lord Lansdowne, Lord Middleton, Munster landlords who had had huge estates and had held high office in Tory cabinets. And they also had Walter Long, a former Dublin MP, a Tory, who had been Chief Secretary for Ireland. Long and Lansdowne led a charge against the proposals. They got Tory nerves jangling. They condemned the scheme as a surrender to force. Within days, the scheme began to fall apart as the Tory MPs rebelled against it. Theresa May's problems were nothing to, in fact, Asquith and Bonar Law's problems, because the leaders of the Tory party had been pushing this. Bonar Law, a man of strong Ulster roots, Carson, who was in the top 3 or 4 leading Conservatives at the time. But they were swamped by this backbench revolt against a surrender to the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And the scheme collapsed, and Redmond regarded this as a treaty, the breach of a treaty on a par with the breach of the Treaty of Limerick of 1691. But of course, the impact of those proposals it diminished Carson. He had taken great risks and indeed suggested great sacrifices for 9-county Ulster Unionism, which had come to nothing. And we now know that from 1916 on, Carson is a fading star in unionism. Yes, he's very useful for a great occasion, but he is soon to be eclipsed by James Craig, and his own defeat will be symbolised in 1918 when he resigns the representation of Trinity College and moves to Belfast, Duncairn, which the Provost of Trinity described in a letter. He's moved, he said, to a slum constituency in Belfast. And if you're from Duncairn, I'm very sorry. Redmond suffered even more. To Irish nationalists, this was a huge, if you like, blow, because they had sacrificed the unity of Ireland, to achieve home rule for the south. Redmond and Devlin in the north were now accused of having bartered the nation for high office. And if Redmond was in trouble after the rising with the turning tide of Irish nationalism, he was been even more isolated from the nationalist base after the Lloyd George proposals of 1916. Well, things moved on. Of course, in the country you have the emergence of massive sympathy for Pearse, Connolly and their comrades. There's a cult of the dead leader beginning to build up as, if you like, sort of hagiographical lives begin to appear of almost unknown leaders. People like Thomas Kent and Éamon Cant are beginning to appear as well, and there's a huge kind of public interest in the men of 1916. You also have martial law, which continues across the whole country. I mean, for example, in Tyrone, there are protests from local councils and parish priests about military raids on houses in Tyrone in the fall of 1916 and the spring of 1917, because General Sir John Maxwell is still in charge until virtually the end of 1916. Then there's the execution of Casement on the 3rd of August 1916. Roger Casement, brought up in that big house atmosphere of North Antrim. He's one of the casements in Ballycastle, Maher and Temple House. His father had been a colonel in the Antrim militia, his mother from a County Cork aristocratic family. He was sent to the diocesan school in Ballymena, now the academy. But of course, in joining the British diplomatic service, he had served his Queen and King in 2 continents, in darkest Africa and indeed on the Amazon. And seeing the excesses of imperialism in those countries, in Africa by the King of the Belgians, he had abandoned any interest in imperialism and unionism, and become, of course, by the early years of the 20th century, a Gaelic leaguer, a Gaelic revivalist, an Irish nationalist. There's a brilliant letter from Owen MacNeill's sister in the Glens of Antrim to her brother, Professor Owen MacNeill in Dublin in 1904, describing a meeting held in a local schoolhouse in Cushendall to establish Fish na Man, the fish of the Glens of Antrim, an attempt to preserve the Irish language then spoken around Red Bay and Rathlin and the music that went with it. And she describes the committee meeting under the local schoolmaster in Cushendall schoolhouse, and suddenly the door knocked. And she said a tall, soldierly, bearded man entered the room. She says we couldn't believe it. He was one of the casements of Ballycastle. They were tyrants in the old days. And Casement subscribes to the fish, presents a shield for a hurling match on the day, and so begins his secret odyssey with Irish nationalism, which he will embrace more publicly when he retires from the British diplomatic service, knighted for his services to humanity in 1912. And of course Casement embarked on that mission to Germany, which of course would result in his execution in Brixton Prison on the 3rd of August 1916, reinforcing the 1916 effect. You know, that shifting sands in nationalism from the old party, home rule within the empire, to something else during this period. But of course Sinn Fein, this party that emerged, it's a name that was imposed on it by the British government. It was the Sinn Fein Rising. The old Sinn Fein party, decrepit by 1916, associated with a Dublin journalist called Arthur Griffith, had nothing to do with the rising itself. It was really an IRB rising. You know, that secret society of several hundred had planned the whole thing. So there are various component parts. But one movement had survived the rising, and that was the Irish Volunteers. They were the marching men in the 4 provinces outside the city of Dublin who had not really been affected by the rising. Some were interned afterwards, with the internees, people like Michael Collins, in Frongach in Wales and other prisons. But they were generally free to reform, to begin to drill. Charges for illegal drilling become the norm from late 1916 right through to 1918, from Antrim to Cork in this period. It's quite clear that the new movement has captured the imagination of nationalist Ireland. Witness the Roscommon by-election, held in the snows of February 1917, North Roscommon. Sinn Féin hadn't yet decided on its name, so the Republicans put forward an independent candidate, Count Plunkett, the son of one of the executed leaders. He won narrowly in that election, but it was the beginning of a trend. Sinn Fein were to win 3 more by-elections. The most important was in East Clare, where Edward de Valera, born in New York to an Irish mother and a Spanish father, brought up in a labourer's cottage in the west of Ireland, a bright scholarship boy, who had become political the night he joined the Gaelic League, I suppose, in the early years of the century, and even more political the night he joined the Irish Volunteers in Dublin in November 1916. De Valera, the Longfellow, the schoolmaster, would be in command of the garrison at Boland's Mills on the outskirts of Dublin. He would be sentenced to death, but not because of his American birth, but because the policy changed. His execution sentence, with so many others, was commuted to penal servitude for life in this period. And de Valera, campaigning in 1917, in his crush, because some prisoners had been released in 1916, in his crushed volunteer's uniform, would win the by-election in County Clare, in East Clare. What caused that by-election? The death of John Redmond's brother, Major William Redmond, in action, an elderly man by the standards of the time, on the Western Front. Mortally wounded, he was carried down by men of the 36th Ulster Division. His last words were heard by the Reverend John Redmond, the future rector of Ballymacarrett. One Redmond to another, separated by a gulf of history, politics and religion. It was amazing. Ballymena Urban District Council, Dungannon District Council, unionist bodies issued condolences to the widow of Major William Redmond, a nationalist MP. But nationalist Ireland was changing, and the seat was won not by Redmond, but Éamon de Valera of Sinn Fein. And that's the way things were going in the summer of 1917, as Irish-American opinion was becoming more and more pro-Sinn Fein. T.P. O'Connor, a leading nationalist MP, was sent by Redmond to America that summer to see if he could turn back the tide, reclaim all the wealthy benefactors in Chicago and California who had been bankrolling Irish nationalism for years. And he wrote to John Redmond, "I feel like James II, a fresh desertion every day." So not just in Ireland but in America, nationalist opinion was flowing rapidly in the direction of this new party, which by October 1917 had held its first Ardèche, designated itself Sinn Fein, and aimed at an all-Ireland republic. De Valera was its president because he was the senior surviving commandant of the Rising. He was a commander who had survived the firing squads. So he had special status right through to the treaty split of 1922. He was, in many ways, a remote figure from the public. Tended to wear long clothes, ascetic, but had a charisma of his own, very much in sharp contrast to the charismatic, rumbustious image of the younger Michael Collins, a junior officer in the General Post Office, a man who thought 1916 had been an absolute failure and the next rising must be on guerrilla lines. Collins emerging in 1917-18 as the secretary of the Irish National Association, a prisoners' dependent fund that he ran, but really as a front for the reorganisation of the volunteers, who would be renamed, of course, by their Gaelic name, Óglaigh na hÉireann, the Soldiers of Ireland, and by 1919 that would be translated freely into the Irish Republican Army. So an IRB rising had produced an IRA within 3 years. This is the background really to the Irish Convention of 1917. John Redmond had suggested, why not call a convention of Irishmen, of different political parties, who can meet in Ireland, can take evidence, can discuss among themselves, and try to find some kind of via media, some kind of, if you like, halfway house between nationalism and unionism. A scheme of self-government for all Ireland linked to Great Britain and the Empire. Lord George probably had no expectation that the convention would work, but it performed one useful purpose for Lord George, who had become Prime Minister at the end of 1916 on the fall of Ascot. He realised it would shelve the Irish question. One American historian, George Dangerfield, has described the Irish Convention, which met in this building, as a piece of Lord George's transatlantic window dressing, and to some extent we have to see it in that kind of light, but there it met. Two things, I suppose, damned the Irish Convention from the start. And this is the convention, its official photograph, taken at the Regency room at Trinity College, just inside the gate. You walk in the gate, you look left, and that's the kind of Regency building there. And it was there that the convention met, almost overlooking College Green, where King Billy's statue was still standing at that time, remember? A statue on a horse. And there they're meeting there. You can pick out the great and the good. In the audience you have Ulster Unionists. You have Southern Unionists, as they describe themselves. Mainly lords and Church of Ireland bishops. Then you had the Irish nationalists, the Home Rule Party. And then you had some Labour representatives, the mayors of corporations from Dublin to Derry, London, Derry. You had bishops and churchmen from all traditions. The Presbyterian moderator, the Methodist president that year, Archbishop Crozier of the Church of Ireland, Bishop O'Donnell of Raphoe, Lord Londonderry, who was a leading Ulster Unionist and British industrialist. All of them there pictured on that day. And there were high hopes in the press in Ireland that somehow Irishmen would see sense. They would get to know each other, you know, in those long debates of the Irish Convention, and would find a solution. But you could say one of the most interesting things was that there was an Ulster Unionist delegation. Nobody very high level. Carson had insisted on the Ulstermen attending the convention. He said that their brief was to defend the idea of the exclusion of Ulster, the clean cut as it was known. 9 counties, probably more of a wrecking device. By this stage, Craig and Carson were probably thinking in terms of a 6-county split that would give them a sizable enough territory, but a safe Unionist majority. You move into 9-county Ulster, and you have a 56% Unionist majority and a very high Catholic birth rate. So perhaps that wasn't so attractive to them. And you have, it's led by somebody who wasn't well known, a man called Hugh Barry, a blunt Scot who had become a Coleraine flour importer. He was Unionist MP for North Derry, North Londonderry at Westminster. And in that delegation, you had a range of people like Lord Farnham, County Cavan landlord. You had Michael Knight, Clonus solicitor. You had Lord Londonderry, representing the remnant of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy in the north. But someone, of course, who was very influential in the salons of the Conservative Party of Britain, and who had a very influential wife, Theresa Lady Londonderry at this stage, who ran a salon in London and influenced British political decision making. So that's the official picture. Now let's see who was who. Lloyd George was the man who had agreed to convene, and it was given fair wing. It meant that Ireland was off the radar for at least 9 months to a year. Lloyd George also intimated in the House of Commons that if the delegates, and they were not elected, you couldn't risk an election any more than you could at the moment, but you couldn't risk it, and I mean here or in Britain, you couldn't risk an election because the wrong people might win. So basically, Lloyd George laid down that if the convention reached substantial agreement, famous last word, substantial agreement, then the British government, a coalition government of Tory and Liberal to fight the war, would implement its recommendations. So there was a hope for Edmund, you know, that if he could somehow persuade a majority of Unionists to accept a very, very perhaps mild form of Home Rule, stressing the Empire and the Union Jack, then somehow the problem might be resolved. But obviously it served his greater interest in attracting America into the war, because America had been a barrier to Anglo-Irish friendship. And of course that old relationship, which used to exist between Britain and America, was born out of the First World War. The convention meeting here, famous artist's impression in the Regency room, it was chaired by a man called Sir Horace Plunkett. Plunkett was a member of the Dunsany family of County Meath, Church of Ireland, large landowners. He'd started off as a Unionist MP for a Dublin constituency, but he was a great promoter of Irish agricultural cooperation. He's remembered as the man who promoted the creamery movement in the 1890s. He spoke at meetings in all 4 provinces, urging farmers to work together, improve standards, and make Irish agricultural exports a much more valuable commodity, and so on. And by this stage, he had gravitated to a kind of a liberal home rule position. So Plunkett, much respected by people on all sides of the fence, a great friend of, for example, J. Milne Barber, who became Minister of Commerce in the first Northern Ireland government, and of course owned Barber Threads in Lisburn, great friends with people like that. But the Ulster Unionists would have been suspicious of him by and large because of his increasingly pro-home rule views. And of course the nationalist leadership. This photograph taken at a railway station about 1910. You can see wee Joe Devlin, the northern nationalist leader, brilliant orator. Lord George said he was one of the best orators he ever heard. And William Jennings Bryan, who was a US presidential candidate, said, having heard Joe Devlin outside, he actually tried to copy him. He was a brilliant outside speaker. He was also a kind of Jay Fitt type figure, and he had that, Sergeant Bilko-esque kind of personality. Once, when challenged by a Unionist MP, he was supporting an Irish language grant to the House of Commons, and a Unionist shouted across, "Can you speak Irish, Joe? Better than you can speak English." So here you have John Redmond, Joe Devlin, and they were the leaders of the Irish race, so described at that time, until 1916. Joe Devlin was a coming man. He was seen as the Prime Minister of a new Home Rule Ireland. When he spoke in Limerick or Cork, the press reported he got a much greater reaction from the people than the elderly Redmond did, because he could always cite his working class roots and his associations with the linen workers of Belfast, for whom he was very much a favourite. And then at this time, 1916, there you have Redmond and Dillon. Redmond, of course, a man who saw the British Parliament as the zenith of democracy. His father had been an MP from a wealthy Norman family in Wexford. He had served as a clerk in the House of Commons. He had worked as a barrister with Edward Carson in the Four Courts, and there was a kind of a friendship going back to their days. They were almost exact contemporaries, both products of Trinity College. John Dillon, a surgeon who didn't practice, whose father had been the famous Young Irelander. Dillon, a very shrewd man, who divided his time between his Georgian home in Dublin, in the city centre. He watched the Rising first hand. He saw the flames lick the buildings in Sackville Street. He saw the mobs stoning the insurgents, but then he saw the change in public opinion after first blood was drawn in the Stonebreaker's yard. He was a man who might have been more effective as a leader than Redmond. His finger was much more on the pulse, and of course he had his roots in the west of Ireland. And here you have Lord Middleton. He was the leader of the Southern Unionists. They had 9 representatives in the convention. The Ulster Unionists had 23. The Irish Nationalists had 52. The rest were an amalgam of churchmen, labour figures, mayors, to give a leavening, as it were. Lord Middleton, of course, you have to remember, the Irish contribution to British public life was enormous in the 19th and early 20th century. For a small cadre, the Anglo-Irish aristocracy had intermarried into the British aristocracy to a large extent. With the closing of the old Irish Parliament at the time of the Act of Union, London had become their focus. Middleton had been Secretary of State for India. His friend Lord Lansdowne, after whom Lansdowne wrote his name, had been Secretary of State for War, and these were major figures in the British Tory party, who had had hundreds of thousands of acres in Ireland, down to the Land Acts of 1903 and 1907. And there were still substantial figures. And this man's sister, actually, was the famous Goblet O'Brother. She Gaelicized her name, a fanatical supporter of Irish nationalism in County Kerry. But Middleton developed a rapport at the convention with John Redmond, which would lead to the sealing of an agreement at the end of 1917, as we'll hear. Lord Londonderry, of course, who would become First Minister of Education in the Craig government of 1921, would try to introduce integrated schooling. Obviously, he failed in the 1920s. Joe Devlin, of course, again, the MP for West Belfast from 1906. He won by 16 votes in a frantic contest in 1906. And 2 old ladies were leaving the count, and one said to the other, "Maggie, wouldn't you love to be one of them 16 voters. She says, many sure I was all 16. No degrees of unionism, Carson, damaged by his attempt to find a compromise with Redmond in 1916. He had all been trying to have, despite his violent speeches in the Home Rule period, Carson was at heart a law and order man. That's what had propelled him into politics, the union and law and order. And he was trying to avoid a civil war in Ireland. He had a broader vision than the Ulster Unionists he led, because he was a southerner. His mother had a landed estate in County Galway, Castle Ellen, outside Athenry, where Irish was spoken on the estate. He had a very different experience to these Ulster Unionists from Portadown and Ballymoney. Very, very different experience indeed. He actually said to Redmond during the Home Rule negotiations in 1916, you should accept a 9-county exclusion, because the exclusion of the whole of Ulster is the quickest way to achieving a united Ireland, something that Redmond couldn't have accepted. So Carson is very much aware that he's becoming involved in another attempt to solve the Irish question. He's just asked the Ulster Unionists to make sacrifice, and it's failed in 1916. This time he's more cautious. He tells the Ulster Unionists they must defend Ireland within the Empire, and they must ensure there are safeguards for the Protestants who will survive in a Home Rule Ireland. He's assuming Ulster will exclude itself. That's what he's telling them at this stage. This is Carson's last political campaign. He becomes less important by 1921. And of course, Major William Redmond, who died at Messines and is buried in the lonely grave, buried by men of the Ulster Division in the summer of 1918. A play's doing the rounds in North Antrim at the moment called Meek and the Major. It was Private John Meek of the Ulster Division who insisted in bringing the wounded William Redmond down. But of course the rising star is Éamon de Valera. Here he's addressing an audience in Ennis in County Clare on his election day. Notice the 1916 uniform, and notice the words of the new Sinn Fein anthem written by Brendan Behan's uncle, Padre Kearney at this time, Soldiers Are We. In 1926, 5 years after independence, it would become the Free State national anthem. The whole focus, this is 1917, Thomas Ashe, a volunteer, has just died through forcible feeding, on hunger strike in Dublin. All of this reinforcing support for the rising Republican movement. Even though Redmond is sitting with his 85 seats at Westminster, he knows that his mandate is slipping away. An election will transmogrify the situation. And of course, prayers are going up for the Irish Convention. This is from the Church of Ireland. Because many Church of Ireland bishops feared partition more than they feared Home Rule. The partition of Ireland would cut off that 10% in the south from the bulk of Irish Protestants in the Lagan and Ban valleys in the north. So, I mean, there is a sort of a fair wind being given to the convention by the Irish press, by the Unionists and Nationalists at the end of 1917. One member of the convention is George Russell. Sinn Fein had been allocated 5 seats. They didn't take the lot, they were hostile to the convention, but they allowed a few proxies to sit in, and one was the great intellectual George Russell, born in Lurgan, known as A.E. He was a philosopher, a poet, a playwright, and a major figure really. And of course, he, as a northerner, albeit from a Protestant background, his aim was to prevent at all costs the partition of Ireland. You'll find his bust and statue actually standing, I spoke last week in Lurgan Town Hall, and there's a very fine statue of George Russell in his native town. So the convention got underway in the spring of 1917, and by September, October, it had resolved itself, it had set up a grand committee to decide the nuts and bolts, reflective of all parts of the convention. Now the Ulster Unionists were pledged to return constantly to Belfast, to check in with the Ulster Unionist Council. So like Antaeus, you know, if they were contaminated at the convention, they would certainly be restored to their core position when they went back to Glenballs during this period. And the convention began to visit other parts of Ireland. It visited Belfast very famously at the beginning of September, 1917. Just to give you a quick flavour of that visit, we read the proceedings of the Irish Convention, which were adjourned in Dublin on Thursday, will be resumed in the City Hall, Belfast at 11 o'clock in the morning. The majority of delegates from outside the city arrived yesterday evening by train, travelling in special carriages provided by the Great Northern Railway. And they name all the people who were there: Sir Horace Plunkett, the chairman, Mr. John Redmond, and various others arrive in the city. But one man, one councillor, whose car had been hijacked during the 1916 rising, a Belfast Unionist councillor and solicitor called Thomas Alexander, T.E. Alexander, his car had been hijacked in County Louth during the kind of minor kind of rising at Castle Bellingham. And he had given evidence at the court-martial of the man in charge of the volunteers, which probably saved his life. But Councillor Alexander spoke to the meeting, and let's see what the council actually said. It's quite prophetic. The monthly meeting of the City Council. Councillor Thomas Alexander, Unionist, said he was glad that they were preparing to welcome the august body known as the Irish Convention. He noticed a solemn resolution passed by the Tramway Committee to the effect that the members of the convention should have free rides on Belfast tramcars. Details had been arranged with the inspectors and conductors, and each empire builder had only to point to his convention button and he could pass through the whole way unrobbed. Was Councillor Twiddell, he asked, chairman of the Baths Committee, asleep that he did not emulate the Trams Committee and announced that every member of the convention should have a free bath? Some laughed at it. Now, for the first time, Councillor Alexander, regretted the short-sighted policy of not having erected hobby horses at Bellevue. Otherwise, the members of the convention could have gone up upon them and viewed the Cave Hill and Belfast Law. Councillor White suddenly exclaimed, "This hall is about to be placed at the disposal of the Irish Convention, a meeting here in connection with the highest and most patriotic purposes for which any body ever met. It is not fair or reasonable that it should be referred to in this whimsical manner. Councillor Alexander, I only wanted to see that a good time was given to these visitors who are going to solve the insoluble." But they came to Belfast City Hall, they met there, they lunched there, and they began to discuss the possibility of an all-Ireland home rule entity with safeguards for minorities. That became the whole goal. The leading nationalist in the committee was Bishop O'Donnell, later Cardinal O'Donnell of Raphoe. But he was not prepared to accept an early suggestion of home rule within home rule. Why not have a federal Ireland, which would give some part of Ulster self-government within home rule Ireland? Because, of course, there was a fear that a unionist parliament would interfere with Catholic education, which received grants under Dublin Castle at that time. Of course, rising stars outside. Belfast has been visited, as is Dungannon at this time, by people like Countess Markievicz, the rebel countess from the big house at Lissadell. Remember the famous words, "Light of evening, Lissadell," great windows open to the south. But this is Countess Markievicz, childhood friend of Yeats, who of course had been sentenced to death for her part in the rising at Stephen's Green. She was an officer in the Irish Citizen Army, but then of course it was commuted because they were not prepared to execute a woman after the rising. Sinn Fein held its first convention in Dublin in April 1917 in the Mansion House. You can see the massed attendance from all parts of the country. This is certainly a movement that's going to replace the home rule cause of the previous 40 years, at that time. Now, of course, the convention continued to meet. It visited Belfast, shipyard, engineering firms, it went to Cork, and it sat down at Christmas in January, and suddenly there was a breakthrough. John Redmond, who was now, though he probably didn't know it, a dying man, he'd intestinal trouble, he was an operation in March, which he would not survive. But Redmond forged a deal with Viscount Middleton, the Southern Unionist leader, which meant that customs would be transferred from an Irish Parliament, or rather would be retained at Westminster. So the Irish Parliament would have limited financial power. They also agreed that an Irish Parliament would have two chambers, a Senate which would reflect the Unionist population of Ireland to a large extent, the landed gentry, conservative interests, and the House of Commons, where Unionists would have 40% of the seats. So they agreed that they would give a weighted representation of 40% of the seats in the Commons to Irish Unionists and a majority in the Senate to Irish Unionists. So Redmond was prepared to go this far to try to win unionism to the concept of home rule within the empire. He forged a deal with the southern unionists. The northern unionists, when they seemed interested for a while, drifted away, and they still demanded the clean cuts of the whole of Ulster. And it was in the last days of the convention that Sinn Fein had its first contest in the north. Remember, all these by-elections it had won were in the south, but now it was testing the water in South Armagh. South Armagh was a traditional home rule seat. The elderly member, Dr. Charles O'Neill, had just died, and Sinn Fein saw a victory possibly in Ulster. They chose a northern candidate from this county, Dr. Patrick McCartan, who was the dispensary doctor in Carrickmore, but at this stage he was under arrest in the United States for having arrived in wartime without a visa, and he was stood up, a leading member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And he was, as you say, he stoked his way across to America in disguise. He wasn't quite a stoker on a liner, he was a doctor, to demand Ireland's independence. And they said that T.P. O'Connor, the nationalist, had gone to America on an English cruiser to work for Ireland's slavery. So these issues are being put very starkly in one of the most nationalist constituencies in Ulster. It's a very interesting contest. Each side threw their major figures, you might say their big guns on the part of Sinn Fein, into the contest. De Valera is there, Michael Collins was there, Arthur Griffith was there. Huge train loads of volunteers arrived from Cork, Limerick, Clare, and the by-election in January, February 1960 almost has a military feel. But perhaps Sinn Fein is misjudged the conservative home rule preferences of the local electorate. As De Valera arrives in the huge square in Crossmaglen on a dark night in February 1918, surrounded by pikemen, carrying these ornamental pikes. A few roughnecks run out of the pub, grab one of the pikes, and De Valera is gored in the side and rushed off to Newry Infirmary. I know this because when I was doing research 40 years ago, when I was about 3, of course, the late Cardinal O'Fee in Armagh told me that he had once had the honour of entertaining the elderly President De Valera to tea at Maynooth. And, making small talk, Dan says, "Where are you from yourself?" And he said, "Crossmaglen." "I never want to hear the name of that place." But Dan survived. But can you imagine the course of Irish history, how Éamon De Valera bit the dust in the square of Crossmaglen? How would Crossmaglen have ever lived and done? In fact, McCartan was defeated, and a Newry solicitor called Patrick Donnelly won the seat by a fair margin by 1,000 votes. This was a major reverse. De Valera was very bitter at Sinn Féin's reverse in Ulster. What did that tell us? And the subsequent defeat of Sinn Fein in East Tyrone, this area, in March 1917, where the Sinn Fein candidate, Sean Milroy, was defeated by Thomas J. S. Harbison, a Cookstown solicitor. It told us that northern nationalists were more concerned about the fear of partition than they were about the lure of an Irish Republic. They feared that partition would be the first fruit of the politics of the next few years and the rise of Sinn Fein. Meanwhile, Redmond, who dies in March 1917, has been demonised as the man who has caused this holocaust of nationalist lives on the Western Front by his support for recruitment, being chided here by those survivors. Michael Collins was in Armagh during the by-election. He would later be returned in 1921 at the head of the poll. But of course, the Irish Convention dissolves in the spring of 1918. It's lasted for 9 months. It produces a majority report demanding a moderate form of home rule as agreed by Redmond and Lord Middleton. Redmond had died though. His lifelong mission of reconciling North and South and Britain and Ireland really in ruins as Sinn Fein continued to make strides on the All-Ireland stage at this time. There were 2 minority reports. The Ulster Unionists produced their report rejecting home rule, demanding that Ireland stayed in the Empire, and demanding exclusion for the whole of Ulster. Notice not a parliament in Belfast. Nobody was talking about that before 1920, a parliament in Belfast. That was off Carson's radar because he believed that would dilute the North's links with the Crown and with the Empire. Nonetheless, of course, a group of nationalists who rejected Redmond's concessions, led by Joe Devlin, the Northern Nationalist, they demanded full financial powers for an Irish Parliament. So there were actually 3 reports. The British government found it easy to set aside all 3 convention reports. And by that stage, of course, America had entered the war, and indeed the convention had served its purpose. And of course, we were into the last months of war, moving towards peace. This would be followed by the conscription crisis when Britain tried to introduce military conscription in Ireland. Here we had voluntary enlistment, not compulsion, though you had compulsion in England. And you can see the cartoonist view that if they were going to impose this on a growingly Sinn Fein Ireland, they would have to open up a new front. And of course the armistice is signed that November at a railway carriage between the German High Command and Marshal Foch. The Germans had stopped the Allies invading Germany. That was a key objective of Ludendorff and Hindenburg, the German generals. They wanted to keep the Allies out of Germany so that they could rebuild German power after the war. They had almost pulled off the defeat of the Allies in the spring offensive of 1918. Power. By the summer, the Germans are being pushed beyond the Hindenburg line and are on the way to defeat. So by suing for peace through President Wilson, on the basis of his very, very broad 14 points, the Germans signed the armistice in 1918. The world celebrates the end of war. Austria had sued for peace. Bulgaria had left the war. But of course we were heading for the post-war general election. Women over 30 had to vote for the first time in December 1918. The very poor and marginalised in Britain and Ireland were given the vote. There had been a redistribution of seats. And this would produce 2 results. The shift in the balance of power from the Home Rule Party, really decimated, exterminated by the rise of Sinn Fein, outside a few Ulster constituencies. So Sinn Fein dominates the south and west of Ireland, but Ulster Unionism, benefiting from the allocation of extra seats to the towns, especially Belfast, emerges in a stronger position to demand exclusion, not of the 9 counties anymore, but the 6 counties. So the high hopes of the Irish Convention for an agreed, peaceful, united, self-governing Ireland within the Empire had turned to dust, and Ireland was on the road to partition. And indeed, the men who returned from the trenches at the end of 1918 and 1919, from whichever tradition they came, orange or green, north or south, would find that Ireland was once more on the brink. Thank you very much.